Good morning and welcome to SANS Institute webcast, Rekt Casino Hack Assessment Operational Series, Part 1 of 4, Vulnerability Management Gone Wrong, with David Hazar and Jonathan Risto. As they begin the presentation, and if you have any questions for either of them, please enter them into the chat and we will save them for the end for the Q&A. And at this time, I will turn it over to David.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is David Hazar, and I have been working in technology for just over 20 years, with the last 10 to 12 years focused in the areas of vulnerability management, application security, cloud security, and a few other areas. I'm also a SANS instructor and author. I teach the SEC440 course, which is the Cloud Security and DevOps Automation course. And then I also teach the course that I co-authored with Jonathan, which is Management 516, Managing Security Vulnerabilities, Enterprise and Cloud. When I'm not teaching, I'm an independent security consultant focused in those areas that I mentioned previously. Jonathan?
Yeah, I'm Jonathan Risto. As David said, I'm one of the co-authors on the SANS Management 516 class. Been teaching for SANS for 9 to 10 years, taught a wide variety of courses, so don't need to go into all of those, but day job, what I tend to do is related to both vulnerability management as well as trying, at the moment I'm working on a project looking at collapsing a whole bunch of governmental networks down into a single, more flat network, but we'll probably end up leveraging some cloud technologies. Hasn't been decided yet, but similar to David, 20 some years experience in IT, general background, long time dealing with security, the operations stuff, all of those kind of things that a lot of you, I think, are probably doing on the day-to-day basis as well. So that's, I think, enough about us. Anyways, you're not here to hear about our bios. You're here to hear about what's going on here from the presentation. So what are we here to talk about? This little company called Rekt Casino, and the breaking news that was posted out on that one with regards to the fact that they had a ransomware attack. And for those of you that may not have seen the blog posts in regards to Rekt Casino, there are blog posts that are out describing a lot of information about what happened here and what's the basis for these the breach, as well as our conversations we're having. But a brief rundown, a quick summary for those that maybe haven't seen those blogs on the SANS website. It is a fictitious company, but it's about 20 years old, and they fell victim to a ransomware. So all kinds of information got leaked, be it the PII, HR, all kinds of stuff left the company, etc. And they found out really some major problems inside the organization. They just don't have a whole lot of governance oversight. We don't have the technical controls, just all kinds of challenges that you have from a most organizations' perspective, but they seem to excel at having all of the problems. And in summary, really what came out of that, yeah, they didn't really have a security program in place at all. We've got weren't really paying attention to what was happening in the industry, because even up the street, another casino fell victim to a ransomware. And because of their staffing issues and their lack of security knowledge, they even ended up having to go to an outside organization to help them get through this incident. So they didn't have a lot of expertise in-house to do much for them on related to this or almost anything security-wise.
Sorry, let me find my mute button. I didn't want to interrupt Jonathan. Yeah, so there's still a lot of things that we don't know about this breach. I mean, we had an IR firm that came in and did some investigation where we kind of think that it started with a phishing attack, but that's just based on some threat intelligence that we have with this strain of malware that was used. You know, that is a common technique that is used for getting access to the organization and for propagating this malware. So I'm going to focus on what we do know. So since they don't have a security program, we can assume that whatever they're doing right now for vulnerability patch and configuration management, they're doing that within IT. And we're probably going to find that since they can't even really keep up with their antivirus, their email servers are out of date and things like that, and they're not even really securing the perimeter, at least the outbound connections, they probably have limited capabilities in this space. Now, that's not placing blame or pointing fingers. It seems like management has been focused on other areas, right? On developing features or increasing profitability or whatever they've been focused on in the past, but security hasn't been a priority, which may be the case in the organizations we're working for, or maybe our company has bought in. But even in the companies that have bought in, I find that vulnerability management seems to be an area where lots of companies are struggling, which is probably why some of you have joined today. I have many clients of mine that are dealing with, millions of open vulnerabilities in their environment. I've had one client that I've dealt with in the past, and when I started working with them, they had over 12 million vulnerabilities, and that's filtering on CVSS 7 and higher. Now, it's a huge, huge enterprise, and there's lots of complexity there, but it's something that many of us struggle with. And even some of my clients that have gotten down to, thousands of vulnerabilities or even less than thousands, they still worry about it. There's still 0 days. There's still those few lingering vulnerabilities that could cause issues. Another interesting thing is just yesterday we got some patches from Microsoft. So did that play into this whole event at all? Were those Exchange vulnerabilities exploited in some way? That was an out-of-band patch release. We know that at least China has been leveraging those vulnerabilities, but maybe there were others that had access to these. Another thing that is difficult with these vulnerabilities is that, with ransomware in particular, is that it's harder to do like forensics and other things to find out exactly what went wrong. Anyway, we're going to focus on vulnerability management. In our next webcast, we're going to talk about the CIS critical security controls. Right? If we don't know, as a response to this event, if we don't know where to start and where to prioritize, that's a good framework to look at, or some good guidance to look at to start determining where we need to place some focus. And if we look at all those controls, a lot of them are related to this vulnerability patching configuration management, which we're going to be discussing today.
So from a Rekt Casino perspective, there's some things we need to look at for moving forward and what they might want to do to relate to vulnerability management. But you could also look at this from the other side of, this is what they should have been doing before the ransomware attack came along. So you can look at it as the roadmap for how we can move things forward from this point, or this really is some of the things they really should have dealt with beforehand. So one of the things we need to worry about is the staffing aspect. We know from the background and history on this that we have 3 IT professionals. They do everything: the help desk, the sysadmin, the security, and the environment. It's the jack of all trades, masters of none, most likely, with just 3 people inside an organization. And we know this is common in a lot of small and medium business size. You just can't afford the specialization, and you can't get the resources in and dedicate them to do the task. They have to be able to move and be fluid inside what their tasking is for the day. And that really, from a vulnerability management perspective, is a bit of a drawback, because it becomes a secondary, tertiary task, or even some of the you become a lot more responsive and reactive to what's going on in the environment, fighting the fires. And so you don't have the time to do some of the proactive work. And ideally, we want to take vulnerability management to that level, be a lot more proactive, what we're looking at, as opposed to dealing with it after the fact, which is what Rekt is dealing with here. They had the problems in the environment with the ransomware. So we need to bring more resources to bear from a vulnerability management perspective. And from resources, that is not only, quite honestly, the people aspect. We also need to worry about the funding to be able to bring in the tooling that we will require inside our environment. We'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation, as well as just the staffing and the operational maintenance costs for any of the tooling and outside resources we might actually need to bring in on a professional services basis. So we just need all of the resources being able to focus and dedicate, in essence, as much time as possible, if not a full-time staffing, related to vulnerability management. And what we're going to take a look at here today, and David and I, as you've seen, are going to be trading it off. We're going to take a look through the various phases that we use inside the Management 516 class, the PAC with prepare, identify, analyze, communicate, and treat. We're going to take a look across all 5 of those areas and offer some suggestions and things to do for Rekt to start out to try and get the vulnerability management program where they need it to be. And these actually be applicable potentially for a lot of people on the call, especially if you're just starting out related to vulnerability management. Your organization is really starting to focus on this. You'll be able to see these steps, look at the tasks that we're going to talk about, and be able to leverage those as you go back into your organization as well. So with that, we'll hand over to David again on the prepare items.
Thanks, Jonathan. So one thing I want to make clear is, even though we have these 5 phases or 5 areas, I hesitate to call them phases because you don't have to complete one to work on others. The other danger, though, is that I see a lot of organizations, when they start out their vulnerability management programs, just jumping right into identification. And that can create some issues as well. I do like to follow a more agile approach to program development, regardless of the topic area, but specifically for vulnerability management. And that's for a few reasons. First, we need to get something in place quickly, right? Especially in the situation with Rekt, they need to get something in place. And so we can't take months or years to develop out exactly what we want to have before we start implementing something. But also, if we take the other approach of, trying to get all of our requirements and policies and standards built right away, it's going to take us a while before we can actually live up to those requirements. And so it's not an accurate representation of our current capabilities. And that gets us into problems with regulators and auditors. And the third reason for following this more agile approach is our technology is changing so rapidly. So chances are, if we're taking more than a year to complete whatever project it is that we have planned, our requirements could very well change. And I've dealt with this throughout my career in large enterprises where we put together a roadmap for the next couple of years, everything that we would like to accomplish, and then something happens in the organization. Either management goes to some security conference and there's something new that they want to investigate, and that causes plans to change, or the organization decides, hey, we're going to move everything into the cloud, which I've had some clients do recently, or we're going to move from virtual machines to containers. And that's going to cause us to shift gears, to shift priorities, potentially even have to shift the way we define our policies, standards, what technology that we need. And so I find it best to figure out, okay, what can we do within the next few months, or accomplish within the next few months, and then maybe have some stretch goals that take longer, understanding that things could change. We do need to take the time, even though it's inevitable that things are going to be changing, we need to take the time to understand our organization, our IT structure, what our technologists are doing, so that we can build out policies and standards that are achievable, so that we can integrate into existing processes as much as possible. That's going to help with adoption. If we build something separate that's not integrated into what they're already doing, it's going to be a fight to get resources and stakeholders to engage with these new processes, or more of a fight at least. Now, right now, things might be easier because we just had this breach And so people are going to be more engaged when we talk about funding and getting resources for the program. That's going to be easier right now. But we need to think long term. What's going to happen 3 to 5 years from now when the knowledge of this breach, or at least the urgency that we felt because of this breach, is no longer there? And this plays back into when we're defining our policies, our processes, when we're getting resources and funding. How are we going to prove to the organization 3 to 5 years from now that it was all worth it? What are the metrics that we need to be tracking so that we can provide that evidence? What are the stories that we need to be cataloging of these are the things that changed within the organization, even if it's unrelated directly to vulnerability management, but because of something that we identified or something that we did in our vulnerability management program, we were able to standardize, which saved the company money. Or, we need to catalog these stories so that we have those and we can provide those stories to help people understand, yes, this is still important, even though it's maybe helped prevent us from having a breach. And so we don't feel that same sense of urgency we did a few years ago. This is something that we need to continue to invest in and continue to improve.
So other things that we need to work on and worry about, as David mentioned, there's a lot of different things, and from what we can do from the long term, potentially if we're looking at it from the near term perspective as well. But one of the key things we need to start figuring out inside the organization is related to, definitely on the vulnerability management side, is what do we actually have out there inside our environment? We need to take a look and understand what assets are actually inside our organization. Because quite frankly, if we don't have an understanding of what the hardware, the software aspects and assets that we have, we're not going to be able to figure out what we have to worry about, what we have to deal to make sure that we have the right coverage related to vulnerability management. And are we actually having the right tooling put in place to be able to check those devices for vulnerabilities, let alone remediate them and keep moving the yardstick forward for us as we continue to secure the organization? So one of the key things we need to make sure is we can do is get that asset identification. And we're going to have to start small. You're not going to be able to go, hey, let's find everything out there all at once. Most organizations end up starting out, let's see what we can do, find the hardware assets we have inside the environment, using either active or passive scanners that we have available. Some even just will leverage what we have from the vulnerability management system itself, because it's going out and checking if depending how it's either programmed or done through agents, it's going to have asset inventory information as well. Maybe the organization is tracking some stuff from the procurement perspective. As new assets are coming in, some of them are being properly cataloged. There's going to be a variety of sources that we're going to have to take and try and fuse, in essence, but get a comprehensive view of what is inside the organization. We mentioned a few items in there. I talked about the active passive. We can even leverage some items like DHCP. You can use DNS as well, just to see what's communicating inside the environment, what's getting the addresses, who's requesting domain names, et cetera, to try and understand what's out there, what's talking inside the environment. And we're going to need to keep this and maintain the asset inventory database. Key thing, I've seen in lots of organizations, I have a great asset management, or I have great asset inventory from last year, 2 years ago, but I don't have anything that's like current that I could say, yeah, I trust this, that it's from today. So being able to do that, we need to have something maintained up to date and current as we can possibly get it. Ideally, let's get it down to the real time aspect or the near real time so I can see what's happening as changes go in the organization. You won't be able to be there at the start, but that's a goal, as David said, those goals to set for ourselves and plan to get towards. Let's get there. But you are going to need to take the time to add to this as well as you continue to evolve the program on the asset identification side. It's going to continue to build out and grow. And as part of that growth in there, while we want to understand what's actually in our environment and what's supposed to be there, we need to be able to find those rogue devices, the unauthorized assets as well. Has someone come and plugged something in? One of my previous lives, I actually ended up having, as a security prime, we were finding out that someone had brought in one of their home wireless routers, plugged it into the corporate network, and were broadcasting open SSIDs just to make their life easier for doing some of the work. So understanding where these are in your environment, you can probably guess that's a bit of a security concern, having in that example the open access point. But to be able to find those and get that as part of our inventory and checking that's happening inside the environment. Secondly, what we're going to need to worry about for Rekt and in general inside the organizations, we got to find the vulnerabilities. We need to understand what assets are there, but we still need to be checking them. Are we doing it with our automated scanner? So the classic network-based scanner doing an authenticated scan into the environment, or do we the agents that are installed on the systems? Both are valid methods of doing it. It will depend on your organization and what you need to have, what you are allowed to do, what you can do. And some devices we can't put the agents on, so we are still going to need some network-based scanning. But we need to be able to check and find the vulnerabilities that are out there. So we need the tooling that pick on the major vendors we got out there, say the Qualys, the Rapid7, the Tenable. We need the products to help us find what we have inside our organization, be it in the enterprise, classic network enterprise, or in our cloud assets as well. We have to find the vulnerabilities are out there. And so we can keep and continually check and find the problems that we have inside our environment, and compare that back against our asset inventory as well, so we know where we're actually getting the coverage we need across our entire organization.
Now, the next topic that we're going to talk about is how we analyze all of this information. And you may be thinking, what information? I mean, Rekt doesn't really have any information to analyze yet. First, they've got to go through and do some identification, and maybe there's some truth to that. Maybe they haven't been doing any identification. But where we can start is there a patch management tool? Is there some sort of configuration management tool? Can we do any analysis of that information that is already readily available to give us some things to work on while we're procuring and implementing some of these identification tools? What are the patches that tend to be lingering in the environment that we struggle to deploy to a large number of our assets? What are some of the configurations that we could improve or that we're failing to apply to our assets? If we've already got some of that asset inventory information, what are the things that are not subscribed to or not integrated into our patch and configuration management, if that's available? Now, once we have more data to deal with, what you'll hear a lot about in the vulnerability management space is prioritization. And I think that all of us to some extent are prioritizing vulnerabilities, even if it's just, hey, the vendor says these are criticals, highs, moderates, lows. We're going to work obviously on the criticals first, or maybe we're prioritizing by the common vulnerability scoring system, CVSS. But we can improve that over time, right? We can create more risk-based methods of prioritization by layering on top of our regular severity scores some information about the asset, or leveraging threat intelligence to see which are the vulnerabilities that are exploitable or being leveraged by certain malware packages that we're seeing more in the wild, right? So getting some more of that either publicly available threat intelligence, and then over time layering on top some of our internal threat intelligence as well. Now, we know that Rekt Casino doesn't have a lot of this to use right now, so we're going to have to start looking at those public sources of information. But prioritization is just one method of analyzing this data. We need to do more than that. I find that prioritization works well once you've identified the certain vulnerabilities or issues within your environment that you can't fix, that are blocked for whatever reason. Because you can prioritize those vulnerabilities in many different ways, and you're probably not going to be able to resolve them. And so what I find being very helpful for organization is acknowledging the fact that there are certain vulnerabilities that for whatever reason they're struggling to deal with, they're struggling to patch, they're struggling to remediate, and separating those out into larger buckets that highlight the risk associated with those vulnerabilities, but also acknowledge the fact that, you know, for whatever reason, we're still dependent on this old version of Java for our software or applications. And so we can't patch it to a current version because we would have to acquire new software or rewrite our applications. Or maybe it's, you know, something else. Maybe it's some other legacy software, or legacy systems, legacy environment that we can't upgrade, we can't patch, or we maybe struggle to do it as frequently as we do our other environments. I have a client where they've moved everything to the cloud, and they're practicing more immutable design, immutable architecture with their infrastructure, where they don't keep things around forever. They create everything from images, and even their virtual machines, they can be running for up to, you know, 2 weeks, 45 days, depending on the client that I'm talking about. And then they have to replace it with something new from a new image that has been patched and configured appropriately. But they still have a few environments that can't follow that architecture or design yet, and they struggle to get those vulnerabilities patched and configured as well as they do in these immutable environments. Immutable architecture is where you never change anything. You create it, and then if you need a change, you will change the image that was used to create that thing. You'll spin up something new, and then you'll destroy whatever you were using before. And it's very common in container environments because it's kind of the design of how, you know, at least Docker containers or OCI compliant containers work, where you don't have the ability to change things after the container is deployed. But we need to figure out what are the things that we can't fix right now. When I say we set those aside, it doesn't mean we don't worry about them. We don't do anything with those. But we acknowledge that we have to talk to the organization about getting projects in place and funding in place to resolve the underlying roadblocks and challenges. And then whatever's left, whatever is still there after we acknowledge those buckets, yeah, let's prioritize that. Let's work on the most critical things first, because that's important. That's going to drive the biggest risk reduction in the organization. And this is going to play into how we communicate to our stakeholders, which I'll let Jonathan talk about some more.
Yeah, we have, carrying on with how we've broken this up some, as David said, we do have to worry about talking with our key partners and our key stakeholders and everyone that we need to work with inside the organization. And that can be everything. Primarily, we're working with the other groups to get the remediation work done. But it's also to understand the priorities, what kind of information we can help them find and discover from either the metrics that we can provide, et cetera, or just how we can work better together. We need to get the communications down and have a good collaborative environment between the parts of the organization. Rekt Casino, as we know, it's a small organization with 3 in the IT. I'd expect it'll probably grow a few people after this incident, but we're going to have a small group, which will make the communicating with those key people a lot easier for us, I would find, because it's going to be a simple, close-knit group, as opposed to, as an example, I work in an organization of just over 100,000 people. The IT group's a little bit larger. So you have very dedicated teams, some are centralized, some distributed, and you don't have to, there's a lot more coordination needed instead of the single small team that's in one location. Hey, we've got 6 people, you know them all, you work together all the time. But still, we need to have those relationships set up and understand how to work with all the partners inside the organization, regardless of the size. And some of the information we're going to end up communicating with them are these metrics. Everyone loves to talk about metrics, but we need to, for us inside Rekt here, definitely, and with organizations that are just starting out, we need to start from a simple perspective on what we're going to be able to measure, record, etc. Because you're not going to be able to get into the fine or that like high fidelity, really in-depth metrics when we're just starting out. We don't have the data to begin with, and we probably don't have the tooling, the expertise to get into it. So we list off on the screen 4 examples of some of the simple metrics we can start with to start to measure off. So as an example, with the scanner coverage, what are we actually seeing inside our environments compared to what we know is there? Back to the asset inventory. I'm having coverage on 90% of the assets. That's great. We got to get beyond that 90. What are my action plans? What's the process to get me so I have my full coverage that's happening across all the assets? So starting to track that. When you're starting out, you're definitely not going to get to the 100% coverage overnight. You're going to start and you'll start seeing the trending, but you'll be able to see the trending and continue to go up. But that's what you have to do and be able to measure against and see, am I doing better than say what I was last week, last month, as you're starting out in this environment, launching the new scanner, the new tools? Am I getting that scanner coverage and showing the increase to get to where our ideal goal is that we want, let's say the 95, 98% coverage, whatever has been defined for your organization. So you can show that. Other examples we have on there talking about the scan frequencies. So how often am I actually looking across my devices? And in some cases, scan frequency may seem a little weird to people as well, because if I have an agent on the system, am I not scanning basically continuously? Which we are, and we're able to pull the information when needed. But as I said earlier on, there's going to be assets that we can't install those agents on. And maybe you are just starting out with some of the basic network tools, network-based tools. So I'm putting in the credentials into the system and doing the scan across the environment, probing into them. So how often am I doing that? So understanding the scan frequencies by those asset groups. As I said, some will be continuously done with agents. Others may be on the weekly or bi-weekly or whatever the schedule is that has been set up. When I was doing some of the operations work in vulnerability management, we were pure network-based scanner. We scanned the critical stuff daily. We did the rest of the server infrastructure weekly. We covered off the rest of the assets on what we felt was an appropriate schedule inside the organization. So you can break up the frequencies, and you often do inside your organizations. Another common one from a metric, just to finish out these top 4, is with the open critical high vulnerabilities. So if you're using the CVSS, are you using what's coming from your scanning tool? And recognize those definitions may not be the same. CVSS does critical, high, medium, low, where some tools only do high critical or high, medium, and low. Sorry, they don't have the critical. So understanding what you have inside your tooling also dictates what you're going to be reporting out on. But we want to know what is the most key elements that are a problem inside our environments. That's what we're looking at for the open, high, critical. And are we actually able to deal with these looking at them? When you start to mature the program more, you are going to start looking at, am I actually in compliance? What's actually coming up to being the remediation timeframes that we've set? Maybe what's out of compliance with the policies. We might not be able to do that all at the start. But that's where kind of those stretch goals David was mentioning before, those are the kind of things we want to start as we continue to mature the programs, being able to measure. Last thing is these closed off vulnerabilities. Another good one to start with, solely because it's helping you understand, am I making progress in the environment, and showing that progress. And in some cases, it helps you even start to look at and understand, am I actually getting ahead? Am I just treading water with all the new vulnerabilities coming in? Or maybe I've closed off 20, but I got 50 new ones this week. I'm getting underwater here. Helps you identify as well what potential resource constraints that you're having that might be able to help you move forward and either bring more resources to bear from the vulnerability management team or to your remediation partners. because like we know a lot of our work inside vulnerability management, we might not be the ones responsible to do the tasking. So we're reliant upon our partners in order to basically do the work we need to have done. And in some cases, we're measured against. So it goes back to some of that communication and having the good channels open and collaborative environment inside your organization, because then at least you know when they are running into problems, they come and talk to you, as opposed to it's yeah, whatever, it's just Jonathan talking about things again. We don't really need to worry about that right now. We have bigger things we have to worry about. Understanding that. And so it'll help the organization see that. And we mention off, this is the next bullet point here actually, that one of the things you're going to want to do, and you cannot do this right at the start, is get the trending. I mentioned you'll want to show on the scanner coverage that it's increasing over time, but for any of the metrics we're creating in the environment, I love seeing trending, because it's actually telling me, okay, maybe this is an abnormality this month for some reason. I've got to figure it out, but normally I'm in compliance. Why did we suddenly spike up? Or maybe we can see, hey, I'm not in compliance yet of my scanner coverage, as an example. I'm only at 80%. I'm supposed to be minimum 85, but I can see I've been trending up for the past months and we're getting there. We're obviously improving. I don't need to necessarily look at that as much as moment as the vulnerability manager, because I can see the trending is still continuing to go up. We're getting there. And the executive and management team will be able to see that as well, as opposed to just that point in time. So I love seeing trending information related to almost any metric I work with, solely because it helps me see the broader picture, as well as when we're communicating not just to our immediate partners, but also to the management and executive. Like I said, the trending paints that picture, and it's often where we include that trending information so they can get the broader holistic views and wider view across all the quarters, say, instead of just what's happened this month or this snapshot point in time information. So that's what we'd want to take a look at on the metric side. And as I said, working with our key partners in here to make sure that we get our remediation work done inside the organization, to try and eliminate the easy low-hanging fruit in Rekt Casino's case here. I'm sure there's a lot of that is out there, just the teams haven't had time to deal with it. So let's see what we can get the communication open, and let's get rid of the easy, simple ones to solve. And then we'll work on the more in-depth issues like David had mentioned, where we have, why do we need exceptions for this? What are our blockers? And be able to move stuff on. But that's where we need to, it'll help identify and bring some of that forward. And with the communication channels, we're able to talk and have those conversations with everybody.
Now, the ultimate goal of all of this is to successfully treat vulnerabilities, to perform remediation. And for Rekt Casino, where they might want to start, because typically it's the easiest to make significant gains, is making sure that they have well-defined and the appropriate technology for patching operating system and third-party software vulnerabilities, because that's something that can typically be automated very easily. In addition to that, building a library of the compensating controls that they have available, and then also the types of risks that those compensating controls will take care of for us, right? What do our intrusion prevention systems provide versus our web application firewalls versus some of these other technologies? What can we use segmentation for? Going back to these big buckets of vulnerabilities that we can't patch or that we can't reconfigure, can we leverage some network segmentation to at least reduce some risk until we can go through and come up with the solution to those other vulnerabilities? Now, as we mature, there's some other considerations like configuration management tooling, which takes a little bit more time and effort to implement. You know, is there a new architecture or design we might want to leverage? I saw a question in the Q&A about cloud making identification, you know, easier, harder. Like, what's the difference there? And I think there's you could go either way. I mean, cloud makes it easier because we can just ask the cloud, what do we have, right? Give me a list of everything that I've created in the cloud, or everything that exists right now in my cloud environment. And a lot of the the scanning vendors, even if you are still doing network-based scanning or instead of agent-based scanning, they'll actually pull the information about what they need to scan from the API instead of doing these big scans of the all available IPs, right? So getting that information is easy, but do we have access to get that information from the API for all of the accounts that we have? And if that's true today, will it be true tomorrow? Because the cloud, it's easy to sign up, it's easy to create things. Is there some shadow usage that we're missing or that we're forgetting? Do we have visibility into all of our different environments? And then if you are still doing the network-based scanning versus agent-based, you also have the complexity of, network access control lists and security groups and routing and tying your virtual networks and VPCs together and all of that to be able to do that scanning, where to place all of those scanners. And that's just on the identification side. We have the same thing over here on the treatment side. A lot of these automated tools that reach out and patch your systems, they have to have access. Where are we going to host those? Where are we going to put those? Not only does that play into like reachability and routing and being able to access those assets, but it also is going to affect our spend in the cloud, because we're charged for everything. We're charged for storage and we're charged for data transfer and all of these things. And we've got to factor that into our design of where we're going to put these repositories. Is it cheaper to store them, store all those patches in more regions and not have to deal with the data transfer? Or is it better to just, pay for that data transfer? And then in regards to treatment timelines, these are something that we should define early, right, as part of that preparation phase. But we should do it in tandem with the technologists that are going to be doing the remediation. We have to understand what their processes are and realistically what they can accomplish. Our deadlines should never be shorter than our treatment frequencies, right? If we're only patching once a month, we can't have a treatment deadline of 7 days because everybody will be red for those critical vulnerabilities. Even though we've seen other companies go to 7 days, we've seen some, information published online that we should be patching within 7 to 14 days for critical vulnerabilities. If we're only treating once a month, then that's unrealistic. Now, we can set the treatment deadlines or the remediation deadlines realistically, knowing that we want to improve and reduce over time, but we've got to make sure that that happens before we move the goalposts. And that's why this communication is very important. And then we've got to be able to show our improvement, and we've got to be careful there. I worked with one company where when we initially came in to do our assessment, look at their backlog and do some analysis, they were like, okay, well, we have this many vulnerabilities in our backlog and we're remediating like 10,000 a week or a month. I can't remember what the time frame was. But our total number of vulnerabilities never reduces. It's staying about the same. So their assumption was that they were adding new systems that had vulnerabilities, or new vulnerabilities were coming out that was making up for this treatment activity that was happening. But after we started looking at the data and analyzing it and comparing the snapshots of the data week to week, we found that that wasn't happening at all. They weren't doing any treatment. I mean, maybe a little bit here and there, but not 10,000 vulnerabilities. What was happening is that, one scanner would scan the systems this week and it had full access to this set of systems and found a bunch of vulnerabilities, but didn't see this set of systems and closed all those vulnerabilities, or didn't have enough access to get all of the information that it needed for those other set of systems, and it closed all those down. Well, then the next week when it scanned, it would be the opposite, where you would get a different scanner and it would see these sets of systems, would open those vulnerabilities and close the vulnerabilities on this other set of systems. We got to make sure that we're analyzing this data, that we're looking at it so that we can prove that we're meeting our remediation timelines, but also that we have visibility into some of these problems that we're seeing in our environment. And so I'll turn it back over to Jonathan to talk more about how we can continue to evolve our programs.
Yeah, thanks, David. It's we have to worry about, as we've talked about, those 5 general areas, how we group things together, but we need to keep advancing our programs. Like, vulnerability management is not a simple deploy something into the environment and we never have to worry about this again. I think all of us on the call, we probably realize that, but it's getting the information and getting your program in place to try and continue to evolve and move things forward and get that mindset inside the organization of the continual improvement. Like it is, as we've mentioned, and David and I both talked about here today already, it's getting what is our current state of affairs, but really how do we keep and move that forward? How do we get that? What's the goal post that we have for that 3 to 5 years out there? And then how can I get myself moving towards that goal post? And often inside a lot of organizations, it is easier for lots of reasons. Some of it is a finance, resource, approvals, etc., is doing it in those small incremental chunks, as opposed to, I'm going to have a vulnerability management project that's in place here. We're going to have everything done in 3 years. It's going to cost us $50 million to do this, and trying to get that approved and actually getting all of that work done. Take it and do them in small incremental chunks. So just slowly work at it, and you can see the pieces you need and continue to move those forward. And so just do those incremental increases and keep moving our program available. We're going to have to start, as we've mentioned, with what we have and what's available to us. We mentioned off the asset management. Is there stuff there today? What do we have available to us from data to help us analyze? What's available for the remediation? So we have to start with what we have, but it's understanding and prioritizing how to get to that goalpost and the increments to step us get there, to move us forward, and understanding, yeah, well, maybe we actually do need that remediation system first before we're going to be able to do anything further on our analysis, because I need more data feed coming in from that remediation system instead of the scripting and manual pushing of patches that we're doing, just as a simple example. Hopefully we're not all doing manual pushing of patches, but I know organizations that still do that. But it's how do we move this forward? How can we step it out in those small chunks, recognizing what we have and moving it all forward? And it isn't going to be something we can do overnight. Rekt Casino won't be able to do it from their deployment. We can't do it either in any of our organizations. It's not a quick fix. It takes time to move this forward, having a proper plan put in place and continual evolution of our vulnerability management program to get to where we want to be. And then when we actually are getting there, we're going to keep moving that yardstick out, moving us forward to get better and better at dealing with the vulnerability management problems. Some things we didn't even talk about today, we recognize that. But just a couple points on there. It's like, we didn't talk at all about application development, dealing with the vulnerabilities associated with that. There was some slight mention of it in some of our talk here, but really related to the cloud and heavy, how David mentioned off there at the one point about leveraging the APIs to get information, but we didn't talk about that. I know we have a question I saw from the immutable infrastructure as well, we'll get to after we're wrapped up here, but how potentially it can help us related to the dealing with vulnerability management. There might be a goal for us to get to that immutable infrastructure, the shared responsibility, because some of the problems go away because it's somebody else's. As I move from infrastructure to platform to software as a service, I remove some of the challenges that I might have in vulnerability management. We didn't get into any of that today, recognizing we have an hour, we can't do that. But we still need to think about other areas that we might be able to leverage that can help us in a vulnerability management program.
All right, I'm going to just summarize very quickly because I want to get to some of these great questions that we have, but we need to take the time to understand our environment and the things that are happening on the IT side, even the business side, our culture, because all of that is going to play into how we implement this program. And then we need to really understand what we have that we can leverage right now, immediately, and then lay a foundation for how we're going to improve, be agile about that approach to improvement, also to be flexible, right? We might have planned to do one thing and then something changes and we have to do something different. We've got to be flexible and not just keep pushing forward with our original plan if things have changed that are going to impact that plan. We need to prioritize our vulnerabilities, look at root cause, make sure our metrics are meaningful and that we're tracking the information that's going to help us justify that program and get support for it ongoing. And then in the cloud, right, what can we leverage? With the cloud, we have this shared responsibility model. If we're struggling with certain things, can we leverage some of these cloud services to not have to worry about so much stuff? Right? I saw a question about Active Directory, right? And how do we secure our Active Directory environment? Are we failing there? Is that an area where we continue to struggle? If so, what about leveraging a platform as a service offering in the cloud, Azure AD or something else to manage our Active Directory infrastructure? Same thing with our database servers, right? Do we want to go to some sort of platform as a service database offering where we don't have to worry about patching and configuring our databases? Because that's something that we continue to struggle with, or we've moved to a mutable infrastructure for everything else, and that seems to be helping our vulnerability management issues that we had in those systems before. But that's not something that is easy to do for databases, right? Because you have data you have to retain. It's not something that's as easy to do to answer one of our upcoming questions for Active Directory, because in order to create a new Active Directory, you would have to export everything you have and import it into the new one, right? And that's not, for those systems that have state that we have to store over time and that are managing that state, immutable design and architecture is not as easy to pull off. And then if you move to the next slide, Jonathan, just to touch briefly on our next webcast, which covers the critical security controls, I wanted to highlight that 4 of the 6 basic controls have a huge impact or are directly related to what we're talking about today. And then, 7 of the top 20 are related to managing our vulnerabilities, identifying and fixing the vulnerabilities in our environment. And so this is a huge, huge topic that is of huge importance. And even if you look at the other critical security controls here, the ones that aren't directly related, a lot of them are there because we know we're not perfect and that we're still going to have vulnerabilities in our environment. And we've got to have a way to monitor for breaches and protect when we fail to do good vulnerability management and something gets on our network. So I'll turn it back to Laura or I'll turn it back to Jonathan to quickly highlight a couple of things, and then we'll turn it back to Laura for questions.
Yeah, it's just as we mentioned at the start, this is part of the operational cybersecurity triad. You can see management 516. We've got the 566 as well as the 551 for the security operations centers, and 566 is about the 20 critical controls or that are changing from 20, but regardless, the 566 is on the critical controls from CIS. And final thing before we get to the questions, we do have stuff still continuing on the Rekt series. Just want to mention this before we take to the questions. Next week, as we said, it's going over to the 20 critical controls. Then the week afterwards, we're going to take a look at from a SOC perspective with Mark Orlando. And finally, on week 4 of March, we're going to be looking at it from a panel perspective. How do we pull this all together from the piece parts we've talked and be able to fuse some of this operational security items? So that's the 4th webcast. But no, we've got about 7 minutes left, so let's get over to the questions. So Laura, I'm going to pass it back over to you.
Perfect. We have a lot of great questions. First one, what role does cloud play when identifying assets? Does it get easier or more complex?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on this briefly, but the easy part is the cloud provider will tell us what we've created. As long as we have an account that can go out there and query the API, the cloud provider will say, okay, this is what exists. So we don't have that discovery problem. I also saw something in here about IPv6 devices, how do we identify those? In the cloud environment, that's easy because we just get them from the API. In our traditional environments, the way that that's typically done is through more passive scanning, passive analysis, log analysis, and there's technologies out there and capabilities with even the existing vendors like Qualys and Tenable and Rapid7, where they're doing either passive discovery on the network or they're leveraging other logs and data sources, DHCP and things like that to get information on those assets. So I tried to kind of answer two there, but we'll see. We can touch on them more.
Great. Next question. How do we address assets in cloud environment that are set up based on auto-scaling rules? Servers that spin off and shut down based on auto-scaling rules.
Yeah, this goes back to the immutable design principles where, you're creating something new to either scale out an environment or to replace something that, shut down for whatever reason. With auto-scaling rules and virtual machines, they're less likely to shut down on their own. That's not as true with containers. But because those auto-scaling rules are sourcing that information about what to create from typically like a launch template or launch configuration that's pulling from some sort of image, virtual machine image or AMI or whatever you call it in your cloud environment, or even in your on-premise virtualization environment, we need to focus more on the images, which gets a little harder to do. We've got to understand what technologies we can leverage to scan those images and that are available. But just scanning the images isn't enough. Then we've got to determine the risk associated with the vulnerabilities on those images, which is a little bit harder to do. And there's not a lot of good tooling out there to do this automatically without some extra work on your end. But how do we determine, if there are 3 critical vulnerabilities on this image and it's used once, how does that compare to another image that has 2 critical vulnerabilities but is used over 1,000 times? And that's where maybe we can leverage the cloud APIs or our orchestration APIs to get information about what's running, which images are running more in our environment so that we can tie that back to the vulnerabilities that we're finding on these images.
Great. Next question. The concept of the network has really changed over the past couple of years. How do you recommend adapting the legacy model of asset identification, DHCP logging, active network monitoring, etc., to the new normal of cloud apps used across a decentralized workforce coming in from home networks, client work sites, etc.?
I think that it just goes back to leveraging all of the data that we're gathering, getting better at data analysis and data discovery, and figuring out what data sources provide the information we need to do this effectively. Like in our cloud environments, a lot of them have in their security center or security hub or whatever their command center, whatever their security capability is, they'll tell us if something exists that doesn't have a vulnerability agent on it, right? And so if we're using agent-based authentication, or agent-based identification, which seems to be popular in the cloud, that covers us there. For our workstations, we can start looking at, okay, where do we have antivirus installed, but no details on the vulnerabilities, right? Or what other agents and capabilities do we have installed on the workstations for our remote workforce that indicate that there are systems out there that we're not doing identification for, or that we don't have visibility into, even in our patch and configuration management technologies, right? So we can do more analysis and compare those data sources more to get more intelligent and make better decisions.
Great. Next one. I might have missed it, but is there a comparison between credentialed scans and non-credentialed? Scanning versus an agent-based vulnerability reporting?
Yeah, I mean, there's definite differences. And in the course, we talk a little bit about this. I have clients that do non-credentialed scanning so that they're aware of what outside external people can see without credentials. But rarely is that their single source of information. They're using that to help make better prioritization decisions on what to focus on first. For the vulnerabilities to get confirmed vulnerabilities and to know which are the real ones that are out there and not have to deal with as many of the false positives, credentialed scanning or agent-based scanning seems to be the way to go for our non-immutable environments, right? Where some sort of image scanning or scanning, setting up a runtime instance of an image and doing the scanning for that for our virtual machines, and then associating that with all the assets that are on that image seems to be the approach for our immutable infrastructure, at least that I'm seeing as companies move in that direction.
Yeah, I'd agree, David. And I think one thing I might have just maybe it's a slightly different read on that question as well, as David said, there's between the authenticated and the agent scans, you tend not to see very much difference between those because they're ultimately going into the system and checking it by looking at the registries items like this. So there's not a lot of difference there, but compared, as David mentioned, to the unauthenticated scan, there's a huge delta of the info. So I just wasn't sure if the question also asked, was there a difference between those authenticated to agent-based information? So I wanted to make sure that was my take on there as well. They had a slight question on that. So there tends not to be for the info you get there, but the unauthenticated, definitely you just see what the equivalent of what the attacker would see from the outside perspective, looking in without being able to get into the system, query the registries with the authentication and the privilege level accounts to be able to query into the system.
Terrific. We still have several more questions, but we are out of time. So I want everyone to know that there's going to be a follow-up blog post early next week. And I put the link to our blog in the chat there. And any questions that we did not have time to answer here, we will answer in that post. And thank you all very much for joining us. Jonathan and David, thank you for your time and your expertise. And hopefully we will see you all for part 2 next week. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.